My phone buzzed at 6:53 on a Friday evening and I had one shoe still in my hand. The message was 3 short words and they came from a man who had never wasted a single word in his life. "Don't go, Ackles," it was my father's attorney. I had spent 2 whole weeks getting ready for the family dinner that was supposed to celebrate my father's recovery from his stroke. The dinner my stepmother had personally invited me to with a softness in her voice I had not heard from her in 15 years. What I did not know yet, while I stood in my bedroom holding that one black shoe, was that the entire evening had been built like a trap, and my name was already printed on the document she planned to make me sign before the dessert plates were cleared. Before I tell you what I did with that text message, I want you to do something for me. Picture yourself in my place, standing on that thick rug, smelling your own perfume, looking at 3 words from a man who only ever spoke when something was about to break. Would you have gone anyway? Would you have stayed home and waited? Would you have called your father's number, hoping he could still answer? Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because what I chose changed every single thing about my family, my last name, and the company my father built with his bare hands. Stay with me until the end, and I will tell you exactly what waited for me when I walked through that door. My name is Ackles Whitfield, and on the night this story begins, I was 34 years old, the only living child of Henry Whitfield, and the kind of woman who had taught herself to read silence like other people read books. I had to learn that skill young. I had to learn it the year my mother died, when I was 16 years old and my father stopped speaking at the dinner table for almost 6 straight months. I learned it again at 19, the year my father remarried a woman named Vivienne Drake, and I sat at the head table of his wedding while she leaned across him and whispered things into his ear that made him laugh like a man who had forgot he ever had a daughter. I learned it once more at 26, when Vivienne's son Marcus was given a desk at my father's company while my own resume sat in a drawer under a stack of birthday cards I had never sent. By the time I was 34, standing on the cream rug of my own apartment with my black heel in my hand, I could read the silence of an entire room from the doorway. But I could not yet read the silence of my own family, not all the way, not until that night, the text from David Haverson arrived at 6:53. I remember the time because I had been counting the minutes against the traffic between my apartment and the house in Cedar Ridge, the house I had grown up in, the house that was no longer mine in any real way but still pulled at me like a hand on a sleeve. The dinner was called for 8. Vivienne had said cocktails at 7:30. She had told me on the phone, in that low, warm voice I had not heard since my high school graduation, that she wanted me to come early. "We have so much to celebrate," she had said. "Your father has been asking for you." That sentence alone had made my throat close because my father had not asked for me in months. Not since the stroke, not since the rehabilitation center, not since Vivienne had started screening his phone calls and saying he was tired or sleeping or in therapy or just not himself today, sweetheart. Not himself today had become a phrase I heard so often it stopped meaning anything at all. So when Vivienne told me my father was asking for me, I let myself believe it. That was my first mistake. The second mistake would have been walking out the door 3 minutes after that text arrived. I almost did. The shoe was in my hand. The keys were on the counter. The card I had bought him, a simple one with a sailboat on the front because he had always loved sailing, was already inside my purse, sealed, signed, ready. I almost did not look at my phone. The buzz could have been any reminder, any spam alert, any invitation. But something in my chest, the same something that had been quiet for 15 years, made me turn my hand over and look. "Don't go, Ackles." I read it twice, then a third time. Then I sat down on the edge of my bed in one shoe and read it again. David Haverson did not send messages like that. David Haverson did not send messages at all, in fact, unless something needed a signature or a witness or a quiet conversation in a wood-paneled room. He had been my father's attorney for almost 30 years. He had been at our house for Christmas dinners. He had carried my mother's coffin. He had handed me a folder of trust documents on my 21st birthday and told me with no smile and no warmth that my mother had loved me very much and had wanted me to be safe. He was not the kind of man who sent 3-word warnings on a Friday night without a reason that could be. "Lit a house in 2, I called him back. He picked up on the first ring, which told me everything I needed to know before he ever said a word. He spoke quickly in the lowered voice he used when other people were nearby. He told me he could not say much over the phone, but I needed to listen carefully. He told me there was a document. He told me there were people at the house tonight who were not there to celebrate my father's recovery. He told me that if I went, I had to promise him 3 things. I had to promise not to sign anything, no matter who held the pen. I had to promise not to drink anything I had not poured myself. And I had to promise that if anyone, including Vivienne, asked me to come into a private room or office during the night, I would say no, and I would say it loud enough for the other guests to hear." I asked him what was happening. He took a breath that sounded like it hurt his ribs. He said, "Your father did not know about this dinner until last week. He thought you and Vivienne had been planning it together. He thinks you helped pick the menu. He thinks the documents on the side table in the study are the same ones he asked me to draw up 6 months ago, and he is wrong about all of it. I asked him what documents. He paused for a long time. Then he said, I am driving to the house now. I will be there before 9. I cannot stop her tonight by myself. But if you are there and you do exactly what I told you to do, we can stop her together. Will you come? I said yes before I had time to think about why. I said yes because there was a threat in his voice that I had only heard once before, the night my mother had died, when he had called my father from the hospital to tell him to come home. I said yes because if Vivienne thought she could use the house I grew up in to take whatever it was she planned to take, I wanted to be in the room when she tried. I put on the second shoe. I picked up my keys. I picked up my purse with the sailboat card inside it, and I walked out of my apartment the way you walk out of a place when you are not sure who you are going to be when you walk back in. To understand what waited for me at that dinner, you have to understand my mother. Eleanor Whitfield was the kind of woman who built things and then never told anyone she had built them. She had grown up in a small town in the middle of the country, the daughter of a woman who took in laundry and a man who fixed engines, and she had paid her own way through college by waitressing nights and weekends. She met my father at a building site when she was 23. He was a young foreman with calluses and a notebook full of sketches for a small construction company he had not yet started. She was an architectural drafting student who had walked onto the site to ask if she could photograph the framing for a class project. They married 8 months later. They started Whitfield Construction together with a borrowed truck and a single account, and they ran it together for the next 17 years, until the spring my mother went in for what was supposed to be a routine surgery and never came home. I was 16. My world ended on a Tuesday in April. My father did not speak above a whisper for almost half a year after that. He went to work. He came home. He sat in his chair and stared at the place on the wall where my mother had hung a framed sketch of their first project. The sketch was still there. He had refused to take it down. He had refused to move her clothes out of the closet. He had refused to use the side of the bed she had slept on, even though I knew, because I am an observant person and always have been, that he sometimes lay across the foot of the bed at night because he could not bear to sleep alongside the empty space. I made dinners that year. I learned how to do the laundry. I made sure the bills got paid because my father had stopped opening the mail. I sat across from him at our kitchen table and I told him about my school day, and he listened, and sometimes he nodded, and sometimes he said my name in a voice that was the closest he could get to thank you. I did not resent any of it. I loved him. He was the only parent I had left. I would have carried him on my back if he had asked. Vivienne came 2.5 years later. I was almost 19. I had been accepted to an architecture program 2 states away, and I was supposed to leave at the end of the summer. My father had started smiling again. He had joined a country club that one of his contractors had recommended. He had been told by well-meaning friends who did not know my mother that he should get out of the house. He should meet new people. He should remember he was still a man. Vivienne worked at the country club. She did not work in the kitchen, though, or behind the bar. She worked in what they called member services, which I later understood meant she paid attention to the wealthy men who came in alone, and she remembered what they liked to drink. And she asked about their week in a way that made them feel less alone. She was 41 years old. She was beautiful in a polished, careful way. Her hair was always exactly the same. Her nails were always exactly the same. She had a son named Marcus who was 23 at the time, recently out of an expensive college, and recently fired from his second job in a year for what she described to my father as creative differences. I do not want to be unfair. There was a moment in those first 6 months when I thought Vivienne might be good for him. She made him laugh. She organized the kitchen. She bought new towels for the guest bathroom. She told me at our first dinner together that she knew she could never replace my mother and that she did not want to try. I appreciated that. I told her so. I told my father later that night that she seemed kind. He hugged me and I could feel the relief leaving his shoulders, and I went to college thinking that maybe my father would be all right. He proposed to her 3 months after I left. He did not tell me first. I found out the way you find out when someone has decided your opinion does not matter. I found out from a holiday card. They were married before the next summer. I came home from school for the wedding. I gave a small speech that I had practiced in the mirror until the words felt smooth and warm. I welcomed Vivienne and Marcus to the family. I told my father I was happy that he was happy. I meant every word of it at the time. I went back to school the next morning and I did not see what began to happen at home until it had been happening for years. The first thing she did was small. She replaced the framed sketch on the wall. The drawing my mother had made of the first Whitfield construction project, the one that had hung in our living room for 19 years, was suddenly gone the next time I came home for a visit. In its place was a large abstract painting in soft golds and browns, very tasteful, very expensive looking, very neutral. I asked my father where the sketch had gone. He looked confused for a second. He said Vivienne had moved it somewhere safer because the sun was fading the paper. I went looking. I found it in the back of a closet, behind a stack of old curtains, with a small water stain in one corner that had not been there before. I did not say anything. I told myself I was being a child about a piece of paper. I told myself my father had the right to redecorate his own home. I took the sketch back to my apartment and had it reframed and hung it in my own living room where it still hangs today. The second thing she did was bigger. Marcus was hired at Whitfield Construction. He was given an office. He was given a title that did not exist before he arrived, something about strategic outreach, which as far as I could tell meant taking long lunches with people my father already had relationships with and then telling my father he had brought in those relationships. My father was a generous man. He was also a tired man. He had carried the company alone for almost 3 years after my mother died, and Vivienne was very good at telling him that he should rest, that he had earned a break, that Marcus was a strong young man with fresh ideas. My father started leaving work earlier. He started skipping the Monday morning meetings he had not missed in 25 years. He started letting Marcus sit in on phone calls. I noticed all of it. I was finishing my degree by then. I was building my own small portfolio. I had decided I did not want to step into Whitfield Construction directly, partly because my father had never asked me to, and partly because the idea of being managed by Vivienne in any way had begun to make my stomach turn. I started my own architectural firm 3 years out of school. I named it a Leaner Studio after my mother. My father came to the opening. He cried. He hugged me in front of my new staff and told me my mother would have been proud. Vivienne stood off to the side and smiled the careful smile she always smiled, and she did not come to the studio again for the next 8 years. Marcus rose at Whitfield Construction the way mold rises in a cellar. Slow, quiet, damp. He did not have my father's instincts, and he did not have my father's hands, and he did not have my father's love for a finished building, but he had Vivienne behind him, and she had a way of speaking to my father about his own son that began before either of them had ever said the word son. By the time I turned 30, Marcus had a vice president title. By the time I turned 32, he had been added to the board. The board, if you can call it that, was 3 people: my father, his old friend and partner Roy Ackles, and after a quiet vote that happened at a meeting my father told me afterward he could not really remember clearly, Roy Ackles had not liked it. Roy had been with my father since the 2nd year of the company. Roy was a builder. Roy was the kind of man who could walk onto a site and tell you in 5 minutes whether the foundation was true. Roy had pulled me aside at my father's 60th birthday party and asked me quietly if I knew that my father had been forgetting things. Small things, he said. Names of suppliers he had used for a decade, the price of plywood, where he had parked his truck. Roy had told me he was worried. Roy had told me Vivienne was answering the phone in my father's office, and that she was the one telling Roy when meetings were rescheduled. Roy had told me, looking past my shoulder at Vivienne across the room, that he did not know if my father was getting old or if my father was being made to look old. I had nodded. I had thanked him. I had told myself Roy was a worrier and that he had always been a little possessive of my father and that maybe my father was just slowing down. I had not done anything. I had not made a phone call. I had not asked for a meeting. I had been busy with my own work. I had been telling myself the way Ackles always told herself that I should not start a fire in someone else's house. That was my real failure, and I will carry it the rest of my life. The fire had been burning the whole time. I had just decided not to smell the smoke. The stroke happened on a Wednesday in February. My father had been in his office on a normal Wednesday in the middle of a normal phone call about a permit. Vivienne had not been at the office that day. The receptionist, a woman named Carla who had worked there since I was in high school, had heard a sound from his office and had walked in to find my father on the floor beside his chair. She had called the ambulance herself. She had called me before she called Vivienne. I will love Carla until the day I die for that one decision. I got to the hospital before Vivienne did. My father was conscious. He could not speak clearly, but he knew me. He held my hand. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who knew exactly what was happening to him and was furious about it. The doctor said it was a moderate stroke. He said with proper rehabilitation my father could recover most of his speech, most of his mobility, most of his independence. He said the next 6 months would tell us a lot. He said we needed a primary medical decision maker and we needed it formalized because there would be paperwork. Vivienne arrived 20 minutes later. She was crying. She looked beautiful the way she always looked, and her tears were exactly the right size and the right speed. She held my father's hand. She kissed his forehead. She told the doctor that of course she would be the primary medical decision maker as his wife. She turned to me and told me in a voice loud enough for the doctor to hear that I should not worry about anything because she was here and we were a family and she would handle every detail. The doctor looked at me. I looked at my father. My father looked at me with those furious eyes. I did not know what to say. I said, "All right." I said, "Thank you, Vivienne." That was my 3rd mistake. There would be more. For the first month after the stroke, things were almost normal. I visited my father every day at the rehabilitation facility. He was making progress. His speech was returning. He could walk with a walker. He laughed at the bad jokes I made about the cafeteria food. He squeezed my hand when I left. The therapists were happy with him. The doctors were happy with him. I was almost happy myself. Then in week 5, things changed. I called the rehab facility one morning and they told me my father had been moved. Vivienne had transferred him to a private home care arrangement. She had hired a full-time nurse. She had set up a hospital bed in the guest suite. She had told the staff at the rehab facility that my father preferred to recover at home, that the facility was too noisy, that it was depressing him. She had not told me. I drove to the house. The front gate had a new code. My old code did not work. I rang the buzzer. After a long pause, Vivienne's voice came through and told me in the warmest possible tone that today was not a good day. He was sleeping. He had had a hard morning. Could I come back tomorrow? I came back the next day. I came back the day after. I came back 4 times that week. Each time there was a reason I could not see him. He was in physical therapy. He was sleeping. He was with the nurse. He had a fever. He had had a difficult night. He had been told the visit might tire him. The 5th time I came, on a Saturday, I parked at the bottom of the long driveway and walked up. I did not ring the buzzer. I went around to the side gate that led into the garden. The side gate had not been changed. I let myself in. I walked up to the back of the house. I went in through the kitchen door, which had never been locked in my entire life, and I walked through the kitchen and down the hall and up to the guest suite, and I opened the door and I saw my sitting up in a chair by the window in a clean shirt with a book on his lap. He was wide awake. He was alone. He turned his head slowly and looked at me. He smiled. He said my name clearly, the way he had said it the day I was born, the way he had said it the day my mother died, the way he had said it every day of his life that he had been able to. I went to him. I knelt by the chair. He put his hand on my hair the way he had done since I was 4 years old. I asked him how he was feeling. He said tired. I asked him if he was getting visits. He said no one comes. I asked him if he had asked for me. He looked at me with those clear eyes and he said every day. Then Vivienne walked in. Her face changed when she saw me. Only for a second, then it smoothed back into the warm, careful smile. She told me she did not know I was here. She told me my father had been having a quiet morning. She told me she would ask the nurse to bring some tea. She walked over and rested her hand on my father's shoulder, and I watched him flinch. It was small. It was so small that another person might have missed it, but Ackles never missed anything anymore. Not after that day. I left the house an hour later. Vivienne walked me to my car. She told me in the kindest possible voice that she was glad I had come, but that next time it would be helpful if I called first. She told me my father needed routine. She told me surprise visits were upsetting for him. She told me she had been speaking to the doctors and that it was going to be a long road and that she hoped I understood she was only doing what was best for him. I nodded. I drove home. I sat in my car in my apartment garage for 45 minutes before I could go upstairs. I did not cry. I did something else. I started writing things down. I wrote down every visit. I wrote down every excuse. I wrote down the new gate code, which I had not been given. I wrote down the names of the new staff at the house. I wrote down the names of the staff who had been let go. Marie, who had cooked for our family for 16 years, had been let go. Henry's old driver, Walter, had been let go. Carla, the receptionist who had called the ambulance, had been put on paid leave for what Vivienne called wellness reasons. Roy Atkins had stopped returning my texts. I called Roy the next day. He answered. He told me, in a voice so careful I almost did not recognize it, that he could not talk freely. He told me he was being told by Vivienne that my father did not want company at the office. He told me he had not been allowed to see any of the recent contracts. He told me that 2 weeks ago Marcus had brought a new lawyer into the office, a man Roy did not recognize, and that the new lawyer had asked Roy to sign something Roy had refused to sign. He would not say what it was on the phone. He told me to be careful and to call David Haverson, and then he hung up. I called David Haverson that afternoon. He invited me to his office. I drove there the next morning. He sat me down in the wood-paneled room I remembered from my 21st birthday, and he poured me a cup of tea, and he told me that he had been quietly looking into things for almost 6 weeks. He told me that Vivienne had presented a power of attorney document to my father at the rehab facility, 2 days after the stroke, when my father was on heavy medication and not yet able to speak clearly. He told me that the document had been notarized by a notary who happened to be Vivienne's cousin, a fact that had taken him 3 weeks to confirm. He told me that the document gave Vivienne authority over my father's medical decisions, his financial accounts, and his business interests. He told me that since the stroke, Vivienne and Marcus had used that document to do 4 things. The first thing they had done was move 3 of the company's largest accounts to a new bank, a bank where Marcus had a personal relationship with the branch manager. The second thing they had done was hire a new chief financial officer, a man who had previously worked for a company Vivienne's brother owned. The third thing they had done was draft an amendment to the company's operating agreement that would give Marcus the right to act as chief executive officer in the event that my father was deemed medically incapacitated, with the determination of incapacity to be made by Vivienne herself. The fourth thing, which David told me about last, and which made my hands go cold around the teacup, was a new will that had not yet been signed. A new will that would be presented to my father along with several other documents at a family dinner that had been scheduled for the following Friday. I would be expected to sign as a witness. The new will divided the company in 3, 1/3 to Vivienne, 1/3 to Marcus, 1/3 to me, contingent on my agreement to a non-compete clause that would prevent me from working in the construction or development industry for the next 10 years, and that would force me to sell my own architectural firm within 90 days or forfeit my share entirely. David let me sit with that for a moment. Then he said the part that made the silence in the room feel like a held breath. He said the new will was structured so that if I refused to sign as a witness, or if I refused the non-compete clause, my share would revert to a trust controlled by Vivienne, with Marcus as the sole beneficiary upon her death. He said the document had been backdated to make it appear my father had been working on it for over a year. He said my father had not been working on it. He said my father did not even know it existed. I asked him why my father would sign such a thing. David looked at me for a long time. Then he said, I do not believe your father would knowingly sign such a thing. I believe he will be presented with it among other papers. I believe Vivienne will tell him it is part of his estate update, the same one we discussed last year, when he and I revised some smaller items in his trust. I believe he will sign the top page where she points and the bottom page where she points because he is tired and he is recovering and he loves her. I asked David why she would do this in front of guests. He said because guests are witnesses. Witnesses make a will harder to challenge. He said she is being very careful. She has thought about every detail. She has invited his oldest business friends. She has invited the family priest. She has invited a notary who will be told to stay near the dining room. She has invited Roy Ackles. She has invited you. She wants the room to look like a celebration. She wants no one in that room to suspect that anything is wrong. I asked him what we could do. He told me very calmly that we could do quite a lot, but that we had to do it carefully and we had to do it in person and we had to do it on Friday. He told me the dinner would be the best chance we had, because in a court of law it would be very hard later to explain why neither I nor my father's attorney had spoken up at the moment the documents were presented in front of all those witnesses. He told me he had been gathering proof for weeks. He told me he had records. He told me he had testimony from the rehab facility nurse who had heard Vivienne's cousin notarize the original power of attorney. He told me he had a sworn statement from the bank manager who had questioned the account transfers. He told me he had Roy Ackles who was prepared to speak. He told me he had me if I was willing. He told me one more thing. He told me that under no circumstances should I tell Vivienne what I knew. He told me she had to believe, all the way until the moment the papers were placed in front of me, that I was the same Ackles she had been managing for 15 years. The quiet one. The polite one, the one who would sign anything to keep the peace. The one who had let her change the painting on the wall and the receptionist at the office and the locks on the gate and the visiting hours of her own father. I drove home from his office that day and I did not feel angry. That is what surprised me the most. I felt clear. For the first time in 15 years, I felt clear. The fog of being managed had lifted. I could see the shape of the room. I could see the shape of my own life. I could see the shape of my mother's sketch on my living room wall, and I could see the shape of my father's face in the chair by the window, and I could see the shape of every excuse I had made for 15 years to avoid starting a fire in someone else's house. The house was on fire. It had always been on fire. I had just been waiting too politely for someone else to call it in. I spent the next 4 days preparing. I did not sleep much. I worked with David. I worked with my own attorney, a sharp woman named Priya whom I had hired 2 years earlier for a contract dispute and who had become a friend. I worked with a forensic accountant David recommended. I worked with a private investigator who confirmed in 2 days that Vivienne's cousin was indeed the notary on the power of attorney, and that this same cousin had notarized 3 other documents in the past 4 months, all related to the company. I worked with Roy Ackles, who came to my apartment on Wednesday evening and sat at my kitchen table and cried into his coffee, and told me he was sorry he had not pushed harder sooner when he had first noticed the changes. I told him to forgive himself. I told him I was sorry I had not listened to him at my father's birthday party. I told him we were going to fix it together. I prepared the way you prepare for a very hard conversation with someone you used to love. I picked out my dress on Thursday night. I picked the dark blue one my mother had once told me made me look like a woman who knew her own mind. I picked simple jewelry. I picked the shoes I could stand in for hours. I packed a small black folder in my purse, a folder David had prepared with copies of the documents we needed to reference if the moment came. I packed the sailboat card for my father. I packed 2 pens. I packed everything I needed to walk into my own family home like a guest and walk out like a daughter. On Friday at 6:53 the text arrived, "Don't go, Ackles." I called David back immediately because the plan had been that I would arrive at 7:30 and that he would arrive at 8:45 and that he would walk in at the moment the documents were presented. But David told me in that low, careful voice that he had received new information that afternoon. He told me that the priest had canceled. Vivienne had told the others that the priest was sick. David had called the priest's office himself. The priest had not been invited. He had never been invited. There had been no priest to begin with. Vivienne had used the priest's name to make me feel safe about the dinner because she knew I had liked our family priest when I was a child, and she had wanted me to picture a soft, warm evening with familiar faces. The priest's name was a lie. There were other lies. David needed time to confirm them. He needed me to be careful. He needed me to stall the dinner if I could. He would be there as soon as he could, but he could not promise 8:45 anymore. He told me to remember the 3 things. Do not sign, do not drink, do not go into a private room. I told him I understood. I picked up my keys, I picked up my purse. I locked my apartment door behind me. I drove the long road to Cedar Ridge with my hands very steady on the wheel, and the radio off and my mother's voice in my head telling me, the way she had told me on the morning of my high school graduation, that there is a kind of woman who walks into a room and changes its weather. Be that kind of woman, she had said. The world has enough of the other kind. The gate at the end of the driveway was open. The lights of the house were warm and yellow against the dark. There were already 6 cars in the circular drive. I parked behind a black sedan I did not recognize. I sat for a moment with the engine off. I looked at my own face in the rearview mirror. I told the woman in the mirror that she had loved her father for 34 years and that everything she did tonight she did for him. Then I got out of the car. I walked up the front steps. I rang the bell. Vivienne opened the door herself. She was wearing a soft cream dress and pearl earrings and the kind of perfume that is meant to remind you of a garden. She opened her arms. She hugged me. She held the hug a beat longer than usual. She kissed my cheek. She told me I looked beautiful. She told me my father was so excited to see me. She told me to come in, come in. The others were already in the sitting room and dinner would be served at 8:30 and there was so much to celebrate. I walked into the sitting room of the house I had grown up in. There were 8 people there. Marcus was by the fireplace in a navy suit holding a glass of something amber. Roy Atkins was on the long sofa looking smaller than I remembered. There were 3 older men I recognized as my father's old business friends, one of whom had been a groomsman at his first wedding. There was a woman I did not know in a green dress with a clipboard tucked subtly beside her. There was a man in a gray suit by the side table with a leather case at his feet who I knew the moment I saw him was the notary. The notary was a thin man with kind eyes who looked, I will say, nothing like a criminal. He looked like a man who was being paid to be in a room and did not want to think too hard about why my father was not there. The hospital chair he had been using was set up by the bay window, but it was empty. I asked Vivienne where he was. She told me with her hand on my arm that he was upstairs resting and would be brought down for dinner. She told me he had asked to nap until the meal so he could be his best for me. The choice of the word me was very deliberate. She wanted me to feel chosen. She wanted me to feel important. She wanted me to feel for the first time in 15 years like the daughter again. I almost let myself feel it. That is the part of this story I do not enjoy telling. There is a part of me that even after everything I knew, even with David's voice still warm in my ear and the folder in my purse, wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe that she had finally seen me. Wanted to believe that this dinner was real, that my father had asked for me, that the people in this room were here to wish him well. I have spent a long time forgiving myself for that part. I think most daughters would have felt it. I think wanting to believe is not the same as being weak. I think it is the most human thing about us, but I did not let it move my hands or my feet or my mouth. I smiled at Vivienne. I told her I was glad to be there. I asked for a glass of water, only wait. I held the water glass without drinking it. I went and sat by Roy Atkins. Roy was good. He played his part. He shook my hand like he had not seen me in months. He asked about my work. He kept his voice loud enough for the room to hear. He asked Marcus about a project he knew Marcus could not really speak to. Marcus stumbled on the answer, and one of the older men, the one who had been the groomsman, looked at Marcus the way an old hunting dog looks at a soft puppy that has wandered into the yard. The room was not entirely full of friends. That was useful information. I tucked it away. The woman in the green dress walked over to me about 10 minutes in. She introduced herself by first name only, Diana. She said she was a family advisor. She said she was here to help facilitate the evening. She offered me a cocktail. I told her I was sticking to water tonight. She smiled and told me that was very wise. She lingered. She asked me how my own business was going. I told her it was going very well. She asked me if I had ever thought about being part of Whitfield Construction, a real part. I told her with the warmest smile I had in my body that I had loved my work too much for too long to think about leaving it. She tilted her head. She told me that was a shame. She told me that there were so many opportunities in family businesses, and that sometimes the people we love wanted us close in ways we did not realize until it was almost too late. She let that sentence sit between us. Then she patted my arm and went back to the side table. I had never met a person who worked for Vivienne so plainly. I understood, watching Diana go, that this evening was not just about a dinner and a few documents. This evening had been planned by more than one person, and Vivienne had brought in help. Diana had been hired to soften me. Diana had been hired to start the conversation about the non-compete in a friendly tone. Diana would, I realized later, be the one to slide the document toward me when the moment came, because Vivienne knew that I might react more calmly to a polite stranger than I would to her. At 7:50, Vivienne went upstairs. She came back down 10 minutes later, behind a young man in scrubs who was pushing my father in a wheelchair. My father looked thinner than he had 2 weeks earlier. His shirt was a button-down he would never have chosen for himself, too pale, too soft. His hair had been combed in a way he never combed it. There was a small spot on his chin where he had been shaved that morning. He looked in every way like a man who had been dressed by someone else. The room turned toward him and made the soft, warm sounds people make when an elderly man is wheeled into a room he used to own. He saw me. His eyes lit up the way they always did. He lifted his hand a little. I went to him. I knelt by the wheelchair. I took his hand. I put the sailboat card in his lap. I told him quietly that I had missed him. He looked at me and he said my name, and then he said, "You are here." I told him yes, I was here. He looked at Vivienne, who was standing behind him with her hand on his shoulder. He said, "She said you would come early." I told him I had wanted to. I told him I would not have missed it. Vivienne smiled at me, that careful smile. She said, "See, Henry, we have all been so excited." She wheeled him to the head of the long table. The dining room had been set for 10. There were tall white candles. There was a pale cream tablecloth that I had never seen before, which meant Vivienne had bought it for the occasion. There were name cards at every place. My name was directly to the right of my father. Vivienne's name was directly to the left. Marcus was beside Vivienne. Diana was beside me. The notary was at the far end of the table with a clear line of sight to where the documents would be presented. Dinner began at 8:30. The food was good. I did not eat much. I sipped my water. I made small, careful conversation with the man on my other side, the old groomsman, who told me a story about my father from before I was born that I had heard many times but pretended to hear fresh, because the story made my father smile across the table at me, and a smile from my father is a thing I will protect with my whole life. Vivienne kept refilling his glass with what she called his special water, a glass with lemon in it. I made a quiet note that I would not let him drink anything I had not seen poured. I did not stop him from drinking it that night because I did not have a way to stop him without making a scene, but I made the note. I am the kind of woman who keeps notes. At 9:15 the plates were cleared. Vivienne stood up. She held her wine glass. She gave a small speech. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about how hard the last 6 months had been, but how much she and Henry loved their friends and family and how much they had been blessed by this circle of love. She turned to my father. She told him. She was so proud of him. She told him she knew he had been wanting to take care of some important family matters since his recovery, and that tonight, surrounded by the people who loved him most, felt like the right time. She turned to Diana. Diana picked up a leather folder from the side table and brought it to my father. My father looked confused. He looked at Vivienne. She smiled at him. She told him very gently, "These are the papers we talked about, sweetheart. The estate update. The same things David and you discussed last spring. Just a few signatures and we can move on with the dessert." My father looked at the folder. His hand moved toward the pen. The notary at the far end of the table opened his own little case and took out his stamp. "I want you to feel what I felt in that moment. I want you to feel the air go out of the room. I want you to feel my mother's voice in my chest. I want you to feel the weight of 15 years of being polite, of being managed, of being the one who did not start fires. I want you to feel my hand reach across the table and rest very gently on top of my father's hand just before his fingers closed around the pen." I said quite calmly, "Dad, before you sign anything, I would like to read it. I would like to read it out loud." With everyone here, Vivienne smiled tight. Only a tiny bit. Marcus shifted in his chair. Diana opened her mouth and then closed it. The old groomsman beside me very slowly put his fork down. Roy Atkins across the table set his coffee cup very carefully on its saucer. Vivienne said, "Oh, Ackles, sweetheart, that is not necessary. These are routine. We do not need to bore everyone." My father looked at Vivienne, then he looked at me. Then he looked back at the folder. He said very slowly, "I would like to hear it." He said it with my mother's tone, the quiet one. The one that did not negotiate. The one I had learned to listen to as a child when I was about to do something I should not do. Vivienne's smile cracked for 1 second, only one. Then she said, of course, but really, sweetheart, you should not strain yourself. Why don't I have Diana read it?" I looked at Diana. Diana's eyes flicked to Vivienne and back to me. I said, "No, thank you, I will read it." I picked up the folder. I turned the first page. The first page was a simple cover. "State Documents, Whitfield Family Trust, March of this year." I read the words aloud. I turned the page. The second page was a power of attorney update. I read the heading aloud. I read the date aloud. I read the names aloud. Then I read the third page, then the fourth, then the fifth. I did not read in a dramatic voice. I did not raise my voice. I read the way David had told me to read, calmly and clearly with no emotion, like a person reading a recipe. The room got quieter and quieter. The notary at the far end of the table started to look uncomfortable. The old groomsman started to look angry. Roy Atkins started to nod very slightly, the way a man nods when something he had only suspected is finally being said out loud. My father's face, I could see out of the corner of my eye, was changing. Not all the way. He was tired, he was confused, but he was hearing it. He was hearing the parts that did not match what he had been told. I reached the page with the new will. I read the cover heading. I read the date. I read the section that divided the company in 3. I read the section about the non-compete. I read the section about the 10-year ban from the construction and development industry. I read the section that required me to sell a leaner studio within 90 days. I read the section that if I refused would revert my share to a trust controlled by Vivienne, with Marcus as the sole beneficiary upon her death. Then I stopped reading. I closed the folder. I set it down on the table in front of my father very gently. I looked at Vivienne. I said, "I do not remember being part of this conversation." I looked at my father. I said, "Dad, do you remember talking with me about a non-compete, about selling a leaner studio? Do you remember asking me to leave my own work behind?" My father looked at me. He shook his head just slightly. He said, "No," he said, "I would never ask you to do that." I said, "I know you would not, I know." He looked at Vivienne. His face was doing a thing I had not seen since the morning my mother died. His mouth was opening and closing slowly, the way a man's mouth moves when he is trying to find a word that has gone behind a wall in his mind. Vivienne stood up very straight. She said, "This is not the time, Ackles. This is a celebration. We can talk about all of this tomorrow with David properly." I told her calmly, "I would love to talk about this tomorrow with David." I told her David was on his way to the house right now. I told her he would be here in just a few minutes. I told her I had also brought my own attorney, Priya, who was waiting in the front room. I told her with a small polite smile that I had thought it might be helpful to have legal counsel present since this was an estate matter. The notary at the end of the table picked up his stamp and put it back in his case very quickly. Diana in the green dress pushed her chair back about 2 inches. Marcus stood up. He said, "Ackles, what the hell is this?" He said it loud because Marcus had always been the kind of man who confused volume with strength. I did not look at him. I looked at Vivienne. I said, "Vivienne, you used the family priest's name to make me come to this dinner. I called the priest's office. He was never invited. You used my father's recovery to make me come. You used a tone of voice I had not heard from you in 15 years. You set me at the table next to a woman I have never met who introduced herself as a family advisor and who tried to ask me about leaving my company before the soup was served. You set this dinner up to make me sign something my father did not even know existed." The room was very still. The old groomsman was looking at Vivienne in a way I will remember forever. Roy Atkins was looking at her in a way that had a very long history behind it. Even the notary, the kind-eyed notary with his stamp safely back in his case, was looking at her with the sad disappointment of a man who had agreed to a job that turned out to be a different kind of job than he had thought. Vivienne tried something then that I have to give her credit for. It was a brave try. She softened her face. She made her voice tremble. She said, "Ackles, this has all been such a hard time for me, for all of us. I have been doing my best. Maybe I made mistakes. Maybe I was confused about what your father wanted. Maybe Marcus and I misunderstood something. We can talk about this. We can fix this. Please do not do this in front of these people. Please do not embarrass your father like this." I looked at her. I waited. Then I said, "The only person being embarrassed in this room tonight is the person who built this dinner. And that person is not my father, and it is not me." That was when David Haverson walked in. He had let himself in through the front door. He had Priya with him. He had a folder. He had a calm, weary, almost gentle look on his face, the look of a man who had seen too many family dinners go this way and who had stopped being shocked by any of them. He greeted my father by his first name. He nodded to Roy. He nodded to me. Then he turned to Vivienne and he said, "Vivienne, I think we need to talk in private." He said it in the way an old country doctor might tell a patient that they should sit down for a conversation. Vivienne stared at him. For one moment the careful smile vanished completely and I saw the woman underneath it. I saw who she had always been. I saw the country club hostess who had decided, 15 years earlier, that she was tired of remembering what other men liked to drink, and that the next man whose drink she remembered was going to be a man whose company she would one day inherit. She did not go quietly. "I will spare you the worst of it." She raised her voice. She accused me of poisoning my father against her. She accused David of being jealous of her marriage. She accused Roy of being a bitter old man. She accused Marcus, in a moment that even I did not expect, of being weak and useless, and of failing to handle me when she had asked him to handle me. Marcus, beside her, looked like a man who had just realized that the woman he had been protecting for 30 years had never really seen him as a son so much as a tool. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered the new will and the line about a leaner studio and the line about the 10-year ban, and I stopped feeling sorry for him. The dinner ended without dessert. The guests left one by one with quiet handshakes for my father and quiet apologies for not having understood sooner. The old groomsman hugged me at the door and told me my mother would have been proud of me. Roy Atkins squeezed my shoulder so hard it almost hurt and told me in a low voice that I had done in 5 minutes what he should have done a year ago. The notary left his card on the side table and slipped out before anyone could ask him a single thing. Diana in the green dress was the last guest to leave. She walked past me without a word. I do not know if she ever worked for Vivienne again. I hope she did not. She had not seemed like a bad woman, only a paid one. Vivienne went upstairs. Marcus followed her. We could hear them arguing through the floor. David and Priya stayed with me. The young man in scrubs who had brought my father down was still standing in the corner of the dining room looking at the floor. David turned to him very kindly and asked him his name. He said his name was Matteo. David asked him how long he had been working with Mr. Whitfield. He said 3 months. David asked him if he had been told to listen for anything specific during his shifts. Matteo, after a long pause, said yes. He said Mrs. Whitfield had asked him to keep notes about Mr. Whitfield's mood, his confusion, his lucidity. He said she had asked him to write down any time Mr. Whitfield said the name Ackles. He said he had refused to write down some of what she had asked him to write down. He said he had been thinking about quitting. He said he was glad he had not. Matteo, by the end of that night, became a witness too. We took care of Matteo afterward. He works for me now. I wheeled my father into the sitting room. I sat on the floor beside his chair. I held his hand. He cried in a way that made my own ribs hurt. He told me he had felt confused for months. He told me he had not been allowed to read his own emails. He told me he had not seen Roy in weeks because Vivienne had told him that Roy was on a vacation. He told me he had been told by Vivienne again and again that I had been too busy to visit. He told me he had been afraid to ask why I was not coming. He told me he had thought in his worst moments that I had given up on him. He told me with my mother's mouth in his face that he should have known better. I held him while he cried. I told him I had never given up on him. I told him I had been there at the gate. I told him I had been told he was sleeping. I told him about the side gate. about the kitchen door. About the day I had walked in and seen him in the chair by the window and how he had said my name. He cried harder. He told me he had thought he had dreamed that visit. He told me Vivienne had told him afterward that I had not come at all and that the conversation had been one of his confused moments. He told me he had believed her. That part broke something in me. That part is what I want you to remember. The hardest thing about this kind of theft is not the money. It is not the company. It is not the will. It is the way it makes a sick man stop trusting his own memories. It is the way it makes him doubt that his own daughter loves him. That is the cruelest part, and that is the part Vivienne should have to live with for the rest of her life. The next 2 months were not gentle. There were lawyers, there were meetings, there were court filings. The power of attorney was challenged and revoked. Vivienne's cousin, the notary, was reported to the state board and lost his license. The chief financial officer Marcus had hired resigned within a week. The accounts were moved back. The amendment to the operating agreement was dissolved. Marcus was removed from the board. He tried to fight it for about 3 weeks, and then his own attorney, a man with more sense than his client, advised him to accept a small severance and disappear. He did. I have not seen Marcus since. Vivienne fought longer. Vivienne fought the way a person fights when she has nothing left but her own image of herself. She told mutual friends that I had been jealous of her marriage. She told the neighbors that I had manipulated my father in his weakened state. She gave a single interview to a small local paper about how families can turn on each other after illness, and she made sure to use words like grief and reconciliation and forgiveness. The interview did not run. The reporter, who was young but not stupid, called Roy Atkins for a comment. Roy told her one sentence. He said that woman tried to take a sick man's company while pretending to celebrate his recovery. Look at the dates on the documents. The reporter looked at the dates on the documents. The interview did not run. The divorce took longer than anyone wanted. My father did not have the heart to throw her out for the first month. He had loved her in his way. He had been ashamed of having been fooled. He kept asking me, late at night when I was staying at the house, whether I thought she had ever loved him at all. I told him I did not know. I told him people are complicated. I told him a person can love you and use you at the same time, and that does not make the love real. He nodded. He cried sometimes. He slept better once she was out of the house. He started eating again. He started walking with the walker, then the cane, then on his own. By the end of the 3rd month, his speech was almost back to normal. The doctors said the improvement had been faster than they had expected. They said it was the rehabilitation. I knew it was the absence. The settlement was fair, more than fair. My father gave Vivienne the smaller of the 2 houses, the lake house, which she had always loved more than the main house anyway. He gave her a modest monthly support payment that would last until her death. He did not give her a single share of Whitfield Construction. He did not give her a single dollar from the company's accounts. She tried to argue for more. Her attorneys looked at the documents David had assembled, and the testimony from Matteo, and the testimony from the rehab nurse, and the bank manager's statement, and they advised her firmly to accept what was being offered. She accepted. She left the main house in the spring. I watched her drive away from the front window, the same window my father had been sitting beside on the day I had walked in through the kitchen, and I did not feel triumph. I felt the way you feel when a long storm finally moves off the coast and the light comes back. My father asked me 2 weeks later if I would consider joining Whitfield Construction. Not as a replacement for him, he said carefully. Not as anyone's daughter, as a partner. He said he wanted to merge a leaner studio into a new architectural division of the company. He said he wanted me to run that division. He said he would hand me his shares one signature at a time, on a schedule we would agree on together in front of David, with Priya present, with everything documented. He said he wanted to spend whatever time he had left teaching me what my mother had not had time to teach me. He said he wanted my mother's name on the door of the office building. He said it should have been on the door for 30 years. I said yes. I cried. He cried. Roy Atkins cried when we told him, although he tried to pretend it was an allergy. We named the new division Aliner and Whitfield. We put my mother's framed sketch back where it belonged, in the main lobby of the office building, in a beautiful wooden frame David's wife helped me pick out. The water stain in the corner is still there. We left it. I think my mother would have liked that we left it. I think she would have understood what it meant. My father has good days now. He has bad days too. The stroke took some things from him that did not come back. He sometimes loses the names of suppliers he has known for 30 years. He sometimes asks me the same question twice in an hour. He sometimes looks at me with a sudden frightened expression and asks me where Vivienne is, and I have to remind him very gently that Vivienne is not coming back, and that he is safe, and that I am here. He always nods. He always pats my hand. He always says of course, then he goes back to whatever he was doing. He is not the man he was at 50. He is a quieter, gentler man. He is a man who knows now exactly who his daughter is and exactly who his daughter has always been. That is enough. It is more than enough. I keep David's text on my phone. I have not deleted it. Don't go Ackles, 3 words. I look at it sometimes on hard days when a client is being difficult, or when a contractor is questioning a young woman in a hard hat on a job site. I look at it and I remember what it felt like to be standing in my bedroom with one shoe in my hand, with my whole life balanced on whether I would look at my phone before I walked out the door. I remember what it felt like to almost not look. I remember the version of myself who would not have looked, because she had spent 15 years training herself not to start fires. I think about her sometimes, the version of me who almost did not look. I do not hate her, I understand her. She was tired, she was loyal, she was holding too many things up for too many people who had stopped noticing. She thought that being good meant being quiet. She thought that being a daughter meant being available. She thought that staying out of the way was the same as staying out of trouble. She was wrong about all of it. I had to learn she was wrong. I had to learn it standing at a dinner table in a dress my mother would have liked, reading a document out loud while a man I once called family looked at me like I had grown teeth he did not know I had. If you are listening to this story and you recognize anyone in it, if you know a Vivienne or a Marcus or a Diana in a green dress with a clipboard or a parent who has started to look smaller in their own house, I want to tell you one thing. Do not wait for someone else to call the fire in. Do not wait for the priest who was never invited. Do not wait for the document that has already been printed with your name on it. Look at your phone when it buzzes. Listen to the people who only ever speak when something is breaking. Drive to the house, walk through the side gate, open the kitchen door, find your father in the chair by the window, tell him you are here, then read the papers out loud in front of everyone. The truth, in my experience, does not need to be shouted. It only needs to be read clearly in a calm voice with all the witnesses still in their seats. Before you go, I want you to think about one thing for me. There's a moment in every family story, the kind of story I just told you, where a quiet person decides she's done being quiet. Sometimes that moment is loud. Sometimes that moment is a single sentence at a dinner table. Sometimes that moment is just a daughter putting her hand on her father's hand before he picks up the pen. I want you to tell me in the comments what your moment was or what your moment might be. What is the page you would read out loud in front of everyone if you could only find the courage to open the folder? I will read every comment. I always do. And if this story made you feel less alone tonight, please subscribe, because Ackles has more stories to tell and there are more dinners ahead of us, and I want you in the room when the next folder gets opened.